Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. My name's Ivana Harinkyu if you're new here, and if you're not, thank you for coming back. Today is Thursday, June the 23rd, and today I am joined by one of our health reporters, Amy Yurkanin. Now, today we are going to talk about what happens in Alabama when and if Roe versus Wade is overturned. Now, we know in early May there was a leaked SCOTUS opinion in the Dobbs versus Women's Health case out of Mississippi, and that leaked opinion did show an overturning of what we know as Roe versus Wade from the 1970s. And essentially, what that leaked opinion did was bring the power to decide if states were going to allow abortion or not back to the states and not at the federal level. That's a very mild overview of that here, but that's something I know so many of us have been talking about for weeks. Amy, a lot of things I think you and I have both heard is people asking, look, if this happens, what will happen in Alabama with our laws? What will happen with our abortion clinics? What will happen to women who maybe already have an abortion scheduled? So today, let's talk a little bit about that. Now, a quick disclaimer, there has not been a decision in this case yet. We have seen that leaked opinion again in early May. There are still a few days left of decision days for the U.S. Supreme Court, but we have not seen a decision yet. Amy and I today are talking about if that decision comes down and if it does mirror what we saw in the leaked decision, what that would mean for Alabama. So just a quick disclaimer there. Amy, I think the biggest question that is all on our minds is, does Alabama have this type of trigger law that we've heard in a lot of states that goes into effect immediately if Roe v. Wade is overturned?
Hi, Ivana. Thanks for having me. And thanks for making that disclaimer, because as you mentioned, as the law currently stands right now today, Roe v. Wade is still in effect. And so abortion remains legal in Alabama today, Thursday, June 23rd, 2022. So we don't know when that decision will happen. But I have been doing some reporting looking at what will happen if the Supreme Court does overturn Roe v. Wade, as was indicated in that leaked draft. And basically what is going to happen is that abortion will probably cease if that does occur in Alabama. And the reason for that is because we don't have a trigger law per se, but we have a law on the books from 1951 that does make abortion illegal in the state of Alabama. And the legal experts that I've spoken to and the folks working in abortion have basically said that to protect their patients and to protect themselves, are going to assume that that law will immediately come back into effect if Roe v. Wade is overturned. That 1951 law does say that abortion is illegal, and it says that anyone who performs an abortion, that is basically a misdemeanor, punishable by up to 6 months in jail and a fine of up to $1,000. But there's no carve out in that law for people who get abortions. So that is the law that it is assumed will sort of immediately become active if Roe v. Wade is overturned.
Well, and I think that's an interesting distinction, is that Alabama doesn't necessarily have one of these trigger laws we've heard. And essentially what that means is a law that is designed to go into effect the second that Roe versus Wade is overturned, if it is overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. What you're saying is Alabama doesn't necessarily have a new law that would go into effect. But what essentially legal experts and other experts believe what would happen is that Alabama would essentially just revert to the law that, again, it had passed in 1951. So essentially, we'd go from a 2022 environment back to that 1951 law. Not a new law, but just the old one. Now, Amy, do we expect then there to be new legislation to amend that law, or do we think that it would just stay as it was in the 50s?
So no, we don't expect that 1951 law to be in effect for very long, because in 2019, Alabama passed the Human Life Protection Act, which at the time was sort of touted as the toughest in the nation abortion ban. And that law outlaws abortion in all cases except to protect the health of the mother. And that law is not supposed to apply to women who receive abortions, but for anyone who performs an abortion, that would make that a felony. punishable by between 10 and 99 years in prison. The reason that that law would not go into effect immediately is that currently it is being blocked by a federal judge. And that judge is blocking the law because Roe v. Wade is in place. Now, what would happen if Roe falls is that basically the state has to go back to the court and ask the judge to remove that block on the law, which is a process. Now, I don't expect that process to take very long if Roe, is overturned, but there is a little bit of a process involved in that. So that's why it's not going to sort of immediately happen. There's going to have to be some documents filed and that sort of thing. Obviously, the Attorney General's office, the Alabama Attorney General's office, is very much preparing to do that, as quickly as they can. But that, I'm not sure how long it will take for them to remove the block on that law and for that law to go in effect. But that law has passed the legislature. It has been signed by the governor. So that law is very close to being ready to go, when the judge lifts the block on it. So that will go into place and sort of overrule the 1951 law pretty quickly after the fact. That's just not going to be immediate. So yeah.
That's interesting. It's almost like a step process. So if Roe is overturned, we go back in Alabama to that 1951 law, and then we wait to see if a federal judge will take a hold off of the 2019 legislation. It seems like one thing has to happen for the next step to fall into place here.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, the abortion providers right now are really trying to. There are two laws that they're trying to sort of think about as they figure out how to proceed. And it's a very difficult position for them to be in. But, I think out of an abundance of caution, the plan is to just go ahead and, stop doing abortions, the minute Roe v. Wade is overturned. But, that sort of raises the prospect of, a very unusual situation where, in theory, you may have a clinic that opens, on the morning that this decision comes out. You have patients go in, and you have some patients who get abortions that morning, and you have some patients who may be in the waiting room who have to leave because they can't get an abortion. And so, it's a stressful situation to sort of try to have all these factors, in play, and really not knowing when this decision comes down. I think a lot of people thought it would be last week, and it wasn't. The Supreme Court they released 4 decisions this morning, but the Dobbs decision was not one of them. So they're releasing more decisions tomorrow. That could be the day, but no one really knows for sure. And I don't know that it's worth trying to predict, when it'll be, because there's just no way of really knowing. But on the day that it happens, there very well could be some patients who are turned away at that minute, even if they came in thinking that they were going to be able to get an abortion that day. So again, that's going to be just a little bit stressful at the clinics, trying to figure out how to manage that. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of where they're at right now. Just trying to plan for the easiest transition they can, obviously with a lot of unknowns still happening.
Well, and two, what about the people who either have appointments scheduled? You mentioned if a decision comes down maybe one morning and there are patients in the waiting room, what happens then? Do these clinics or these doctors, these hospitals, other places that are doing these procedures, do they then work to try to get their patients to maybe another state to see where this would be legal? Again, in this situation, a state that maybe would be welcoming to people coming in from out of state who are looking to get an abortion? Or would they just say, look, I'm sorry, we cannot do this right now by law, and send them home?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure how they plan to address that. But I do know that obviously their first concern is going to be with those patients who are, potentially turned away that day, and trying to make sure that that there is some sort of plan. And it isn't necessarily the abortion clinics, but there are abortion funds out there. Alabama has one. A lot of states have them. In Alabama, it's called, I think, the Yellowhammer Abortion Fund. And some of these organizations, what they do is try to help women pay for abortions if they can't afford them, because, and obviously there's, Medicaid doesn't pay for abortions in Alabama. So if someone wants an abortion and can't afford it, they will sometimes help with that end of things. So those organizations may have to sort of pivot at that point to trying to help people who will have to travel out of state, may have to go to, Florida, if the time limit ban is not in effect, or Georgia, or even as far as Illinois. I've heard that one mentioned. Obviously, some states may not have immediate abortion bans, but they may pass them later on. So the geographic distance that someone has to travel to get an abortion, the distance is going to get a lot further. And I've heard Illinois mentioned a lot as a state, but that's obviously quite a long drive from here. So, the amount that these funds will have to raise for people is going to have to be a lot higher.
Well, and also too, let's look at if there are any exceptions here. So let's first talk about the 1951 law there. What does that say? Are there any exceptions there for women who are victims of rape, incest, or any other exceptions where an abortion in that 1951 law that we assume would go into effect immediately if Roe is overturned? Are there any exceptions for abortions in that legislation?
It's a pretty short law, and no, it's similar to the Human Life Protection Act. The only exception really is for the health of the mother. So that's the only, circumstance where an abortion would be considered legal in Alabama. Neither that law nor the Human Life Protection Act have any exceptions for rape or incest. So it really would ban it pretty much across the board, unless, we're talking about a life or death situation.
Well, how different you talk about that act? That is that 2019 law that is right now stuck on hold in a federal court. How different is the 1951 law and the 2019 law?
So the main difference between the two laws is basically the level of punishment that exists for someone who does an abortion. Both laws really primarily target people who perform abortion, so abortion providers. In the 1951 law, the punishments are really not very big. It's basically $1,000 fine and about 6 months in jail, and it's a misdemeanor. The Human Life Protection Act, it makes performing an abortion a Class A felony, which is the highest level of felony. And the sentence for a Class A felony ranges between 10 years and 99 years. So that is what would go into effect if that law. So it really increases the penalty for abortion providers. The other difference is that in the Human Life Protection Act, it sort of specifically says, a person who receives an abortion shall not be held liable in this case. And the 1951 law does not make that exception. And so, I think you could see a scenario where a lot of abortions now are medication abortions, which is, someone takes pills instead of having a surgical abortion. So I think in theory, a woman who takes a pill, could be considered someone who has performed an abortion. So while the 2019 Act sort of exempts women who receive abortions from these kinds of prosecutions, the 1951 law does not. So in theory, it could be used against a woman who perhaps takes a pill to induce an abortion.
Well, it seems like there's a lot of gray area in both of these laws. Now, another question I wanted to ask, and this is one that I got here in the comments, is the enforcement of this. So we know, again, if this goes into effect and if the state law says that abortions are illegal, what about the doctors or the people who are the nurses, the staff of these places that are performing abortions? How are they going to be held liable? Is this going to depend on policemen walking in, and or this going to depend on federal agents walking in and making sure there are no abortions being performed? Does this mean that pregnancies must be reported to some type of agency who then checks up on it? What's the enforcement like here?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of unknowns, and I would assume that probably what would happen is that it would be enforced like a lot of other laws that sort of we apply in Alabama to women who are pregnant. The law that I've covered quite a bit is a chemical endangerment law, which often is used against women who use drugs during pregnancy. So in that case, enforcement often kind of comes through hospitals, I would say. If a hospital staff member reports a baby born, that tests positive for drugs, that will be reported ultimately to law enforcement. In this case, I mean, it's really hard to say, but I imagine if there was, I think the worry is that if there is a woman who is experiencing a miscarriage or a medication abortion and goes to a hospital, that could then be reported to law enforcement, and that it could be enforced that way. Again, the law is not supposed to apply to women who receive abortions, but I imagine that if law enforcement hears about abortions happening, they will investigate it like they would any other felony, and sort of try to get to the bottom of whether those abortions are happening in Alabama. And then if they find out that they are, would then arrest whoever is providing the surgery or the medication, and apply that Human Life Protection Act law.
Amy, there's a lot here that we don't know, just because again we have not had a decision yet in that Dobbs case from the U.S. Supreme Court. Again, there are several days left of decisions for the Supreme Court. So that decision in Dobbs, which is what we know as the leaked opinion from early May that overturned Roe v. Wade in the leaked opinion, it hasn't come yet. So there's a lot of unknowns just based on that. And there's also a lot of unknowns based on the gray area in these laws, and especially that 1951 law. We know how much the world has changed since 1951. And we know that that language might not be applicable or might be extremely gray in some areas. As you mentioned, an abortion pill was not something that they probably envisioned when they wrote that law in 1951. So a lot of unknowns here. I know you and the rest of our team at AL.com are going to keep an eye on this for the next several decision days from the Supreme Court. And whatever happens there, I know you'll be reporting on that. So thank you for your work on this and for your continued reporting.
All right. Thank you, Ivana.
Everybody watching, thank you so much. Make sure you keep up with all of this news on AL.com. We're going to leave some relevant links here to what Amy and I were discussing, so you can read up on those. And we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.